Few conflicts in modern history have drawn as much global attention, emotion, and division as the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. But to truly understand the violence in Gaza, the street protests in Jerusalem, and the diplomatic stalemates in New York, we must go back, not just years but centuries. This is not merely a political dispute over borders. It is a battle rooted in deep historical claims, ancient faith, colonial promises broken, wars waged, homes lost, and generations of pain carried forward. From the days of ancient kingdoms and Roman conquest to British colonial ambitions, Holocaust, survival, refugee camps, intifadas, peace accords, and modern warfare. This land has been both a promised sanctuary and a crucible of suffering. What began as two peoples seeking self-determination on the same land has become one of the world's longest-running and most emotionally charged conflicts. Over the decades, hopes for peace have been born and crushed, leaders assassinated, treaties signed and shattered, and millions caught in a cycle of trauma, occupation, resistance, and retaliation. This video explores the full historical arc of the Israel-Palestine conflict, from ancient roots and 20th century upheaval to the rise of Gaza's blockade and the bloody devastation of 2023-2024. Through facts, turning points, and untold perspectives, we attempt to answer the painful question: how did we get here? The roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict can be traced back thousands of years to the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, where Jewish people established their early civilizations. These lands, considered holy by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, were home to temples, prophets, and sacred traditions. Over time, powerful empires like the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and finally the Romans invaded the region. In 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Temple in Jerusalem and expelled many Jews, scattering them across the world in what is known as the Jewish diaspora. Meanwhile, the region, then called Palestine, remained predominantly inhabited by various Semitic peoples, including early Christians and later Muslims. For centuries, Jerusalem stood as a spiritual beacon, claimed by faiths and empires alike. Although the ancient Jewish presence left a deep historical and emotional claim to the land, generations of other communities had since laid down roots, setting the stage for a future struggle over sacred soil. From 1517 until the early 20th century, the region of Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Under Ottoman rule, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side in a relatively stable, if imperfect, coexistence. The population of Palestine was predominantly Arab and mostly Muslim, with Christian and Jewish minorities. However, by the late 1800s, winds of change began to stir. In Europe, violent waves of anti-Semitism and pogroms drove Jewish thinkers to call for a return to their ancestral homeland, a movement known as Zionism. Inspired by nationalism and a longing for safety, Jewish immigrants began purchasing land and settling in Palestine, then a quiet corner of the Ottoman Empire. Though small in number at first, these settlers planted the seeds of a coming demographic shift. Tensions quietly simmered between local Arab villagers, who feared dispossession, and the new arrivals, who dreamed of revival. The land that had once been a crossroads of faith and culture would soon become a battleground for identity, survival, and sovereignty. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations, Mandate. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the time, this region was already inhabited by a majority Arab population who were never consulted about this decision. Jewish immigration increased dramatically, especially as Jews fled rising anti-Semitism in Europe, including Nazi persecution. Tensions escalated as Palestinian Arabs feared being displaced from their ancestral lands. Clashes between Jews and Arabs became more frequent, and both sides formed militias. British forces, unable to manage the rising unrest, often responded with repression. Between 1936 and 1939, the Arab revolt shook Palestine as Arabs demanded independence and an end to Jewish immigration. Britain's failure to create a sustainable political solution only deepened divisions. By the 1940s, the land was bitterly divided, with the British stuck between two increasingly hostile and armed communities. As World War II ended and the horrors of the Holocaust came to light, international sympathy for Jewish survivors surged. Britain, exhausted and unable to maintain control, referred the Palestine question to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan. The land would be divided into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the plan reluctantly, viewing it as a stepping stone toward statehood. However, Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab nations rejected the plan, arguing it was unjust to give over half the land to a group that made up less than a third of the population at the time. Violence erupted between the communities almost immediately. When the State of Israel was declared on May 14, 1948, 5 Arab nations invaded in support of the Palestinians. The war ended in an Israeli victory, but at a terrible cost. More than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes in what they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. Hundreds of villages were destroyed, and a massive refugee crisis began, one that still exists today. For Israelis, it was a war of survival and independence. For Palestinians, it marked the beginning of an enduring dispossession. The years following Israel's independence were marked by a series of wars that reshaped the Middle East and deepened the Israeli-Palestinian divide. In 1956, the Suez Crisis erupted when Israel, Britain, and France launched a military campaign against Egypt after President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Although Israel gained some military ground, international pressure, particularly from the United States and Soviet Union, forced a withdrawal. But the most transformative conflict came in 1967, during the Six-Day War, when Israel preemptively struck Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In just under a week, Israel seized vast territories: the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. For Palestinians, this marked the beginning of military occupation in both Gaza and the West Bank. Israel now controlled all of historic Palestine, but the occupation turned daily life into a cycle of checkpoints, curfews, and arrests for many Palestinians. International calls for Israel to withdraw from the newly occupied lands, as outlined in UN Resolution 242, went largely unanswered. The dreams of a Palestinian state began to dim, replaced by rising resentment and hopelessness. As Israeli settlements expanded across the occupied territories, the Palestinian national identity became more politically organized and internationally visible. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was founded to represent Palestinians and their quest for self-determination. Initially rooted in armed struggle, the PLO launched attacks from neighboring countries, especially Jordan and Lebanon, resulting in retaliatory strikes and regional instability. In the eyes of many Palestinians, armed resistance was the only way to be heard. To many Israelis, it was terrorism. Meanwhile, Palestinian refugee camps across the Middle East swelled in size and despair. Then, in 1987, frustration boiled over. In the first Intifada, a grassroots uprising in the West Bank and Gaza against Israeli occupation. Fueled by decades of humiliation and despair, Palestinians took to the streets in protests, boycotts, and clashes with Israeli soldiers. Images of young boys throwing stones at tanks became iconic. Israel responded with military force, leading to thousands of casualties and international condemnation. Yet the Intifada also changed the narrative. No longer was the conflict seen merely as a regional dispute. It was now clearly a people under occupation seeking justice. The early 1990s brought a flicker of hope to the long-standing conflict. After decades of hostility, secret negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, culminated in the historic Oslo Accords of 1993. For the first time, both sides publicly recognized each other. Israel acknowledged the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist. The handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn was beamed, across the world as a symbol of a new beginning. The agreements gave birth to the Palestinian Authority, allowing limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. But while many rejoiced, hardliners on both sides felt betrayed. Settler violence, Palestinian militant attacks, and mutual distrust chipped away at the fragile peace. In 1995, Rabin, one of the main architects of Oslo, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist. His death symbolized how deeply divided Israeli society had become over peace. Meanwhile, Palestinians grew disillusioned with broken promises, expanding settlements, and stalled negotiations. By the end of the decade, the dream of a two-state solution was hanging by a thread. In the year 2000, peace talks collapsed once again, this time with devastating consequences. After Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa mosque compound, a sacred site in Jerusalem, widespread protests broke out and quickly escalated into the Second Intifada. But unlike the first uprising, this one was bloodier and deadlier. Suicide bombings, targeted assassinations, airstrikes, and military incursions became part of daily life. Israel responded with overwhelming force, reoccupying areas under Palestinian control and constructing a separation barrier in the West Bank. Over 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. The violence hardened attitudes on both sides and destroyed what little trust remained. Then came a dramatic political shift. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlers and troops from Gaza, hoping to disengage. But instead of peace, Gaza descended into chaos. In 2006, the Islamist group Hamas won Palestinian elections, sparking conflict with Fatah, the dominant party in the West Bank. By 2007, Hamas had taken full control of Gaza, leading Israel and Egypt to impose a crippling blockade. The coastal strip, densely populated and impoverished, became a sealed-off enclave, cut off from the world and teetering on the edge of humanitarian disaster. What was once seen as a step toward peace became another chapter of division, siege, and despair. The years that followed Gaza's isolation were marked by a devastating cycle of war and fragile ceasefires. With Hamas in control of Gaza and Israel, viewing the group as a terrorist organization, tensions frequently escalated into full-scale conflict. The first major war erupted in 2008-2009 when Israel launched Operation Cast Lead following a barrage of rockets fired from Gaza. Over 1,400 Palestinians, many of them civilians, and 13 Israelis were killed. The devastation shocked the world, yet it was only the beginning. In 2012, conflict flared again, followed by a far deadlier war in 2014, during which more than 2,200 Palestinians and 73 Israelis died. Gaza's infrastructure was shattered. Homes, schools, and hospitals were reduced to rubble. Each war ended with an uneasy ceasefire, only for violence to erupt again. In 2021, during the holy month of Ramadan, Israeli police raids at the Al-Aqsa mosque and the threatened eviction of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah ignited another explosion. Hamas fired thousands of rockets. Israel responded with overwhelming airstrikes. Once again, civilians bore the brunt. International condemnation surged, but no real resolution followed. Gaza remained under blockade. Reconstruction was minimal, and a traumatized generation of Palestinians grew up amid ruins and despair. The most catastrophic escalation came on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched an unprecedented surprise attack across the border into Israel. Armed militants stormed Israeli towns and kibbutzim, killing over 2,200 people and taking more than 250 hostages, including women and children. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, and it triggered a furious response. Israel declared war, initiating one of the most aggressive military campaigns in Gaza's history. The operation began with relentless airstrikes and soon turned into a full-scale ground invasion. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah were obliterated. The civilian death toll soared as Israel targeted what it said were Hamas command centers embedded in residential areas. By early 2024, more than 50,000 Palestinians were reported dead, and nearly the entire population of Gaza, over 2.3 million people, had been displaced. Hospitals collapsed under the weight of the wounded, and humanitarian aid was blocked or delayed. As graphic images of suffering flooded the global media, protests erupted from London to Jakarta, calling for an immediate ceasefire. World leaders were split, some defending Israel's right to self-defense, others accusing it of disproportionate force. Ceasefires were attempted, but none lasted. The world watched, horrified, as Gaza burned and diplomacy failed. As the war dragged on through 2024 and into 2025, Gaza's humanitarian nightmare deepened into one of the worst crises in modern history. With nearly every hospital bombed or overrun, medical care became nearly non-existent. Children died from preventable infections, pregnant women gave birth in tents, and waterborne diseases spread rapidly through overcrowded refugee shelters. More than 1.9 million people were internally displaced, families forced to flee repeatedly as Israeli strikes moved from north to south. Gaza, already one of the most densely populated places on Earth, was reduced to rubble. Fuel shortages crippled electricity and water systems, leaving residents to scavenge for clean water and food. Meanwhile, the international community was bitterly divided. While Western powers like the United States continued to support Israel militarily and diplomatically, nations across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East condemned the bombardment as collective punishment. Protests exploded worldwide, especially among young people, who flooded social media with demands for justice. The United Nations, along with NGOs, issued desperate calls for a ceasefire, and even longtime allies of Israel began questioning the scale and ethics of the response. But on the ground, nothing changed. Gaza remained blockaded, bleeding, and voiceless. Despite global outrage and mounting pressure, the root causes of the Israel-Palestine conflict remain unresolved, and the path forward is as murky as ever. The status of Jerusalem, claimed as a capital by both Israelis and Palestinians, remains a flashpoint. The right of return for millions of Palestinian refugees, displaced since 1948 and their descendants, is still denied. Israeli settlements continue to expand in the West Bank, fracturing any hope for a contiguous Palestinian state. Hamas remains entrenched in Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank struggles with legitimacy and public trust. On the Israeli side, fear and trauma run deep, with calls for absolute security shaping hardline policies. Peace talks have been abandoned, replaced by militarized containment and diplomatic stagnation. As of mid-2025, more than 52,000 Palestinians and 1,700 Israelis had been killed since the outbreak of the 2023 war, numbers that continue to climb. The conflict has not only scarred landscapes but also hardened hearts. And while international voices demand peace, few are willing or able to take the bold steps needed to achieve it. The tragedy of Israel and Palestine remains a haunting testament to the failure of politics, the power of history, and the human cost of injustice left unresolved. Despite more than a century of conflict, countless negotiations, and waves of violence, the Israel-Palestine issue remains one of the most intractable and painful disputes in modern history. At its heart lies a tragic paradox. Two peoples, both with deep historical, emotional, and spiritual ties to the same land, locked in a cycle of mutual fear, trauma, and distrust, yet neither able to walk away from their claims. The status of Jerusalem, sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, continues to be a geopolitical powder keg. Israel considers the entire city its eternal, undivided capital, while Palestinians view East Jerusalem as the rightful capital of their future state. International law does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over all of Jerusalem, but few global powers have taken concrete steps to enforce that stance. The issue of refugees, millions of Palestinians living in exile or in refugee camps from Lebanon to Jordan, still holding on to keys from homes lost in 1948, remains unresolved. Their demand for the right of return is seen by Israel as a demographic threat, while for Palestinians, it is a sacred, non-negotiable right tied to their very identity. Meanwhile, the West Bank continues to be sliced into disconnected patches by an ever-growing network of Israeli settlements, deemed illegal under international law but expanding nonetheless. Palestinian movement is restricted by walls, checkpoints, and military zones, creating daily indignities that fuel resentment and despair. Young Palestinians are growing up knowing more about drones and tear gas than freedom or opportunity. In Gaza, Hamas remains in control, isolated and under siege. The repeated wars and ongoing blockade have created a generation of traumatized children, many of whom have never left the Strip or seen clean drinking water from a faucet. With unemployment soaring above 70% and basic infrastructure shattered, Gaza has been described by the UN as unlivable. Yet its people endure, surviving on hope, resistance, and the memory of a homeland they feel slipping further away. Internationally, fatigue has set in. The so-called peace process has become a hollow phrase. World leaders issue statements of concern and condemnation, but rarely act. The United States, long seen as a broker, is often criticized for bias and inaction. The Arab world, once a loud voice for Palestinian rights, has largely normalized relations with Israel, leaving Palestinians feeling abandoned. Meanwhile, a new generation, connected by social media, documentaries, and protest movements, has begun to reframe the narrative from geopolitics to human rights, shifting global opinion in ways that could alter the future. And yet, despite the rubble, despite the funerals, the checkpoints, and the ceasefires that never last, there remains a sliver of hope. A belief that justice, no matter how long delayed, is still worth fighting for. That dignity is not negotiable. That children born into this conflict may one day inherit a future not defined by occupation, rockets, or walls, but by peace, coexistence, and mutual respect. But that future will not come easily. It demands courage, political, moral, and human. It requires listening, compromise, and a reckoning with history. Until then, the conflict remains a wound that bleeds not only in the Holy Land, but in the conscience of the world.